And I don't know what was the chicken or the egg, but it certainly made sense when I started to find out what was going on. I don't know if other people on Synthroid have found this out. There seems to be a honeymoon phase, and then it doesn't work anymore. I actually started losing my hair when I was taking that medication. After that, I was what I would consider like a raging carboholic. I could barely eat. That's why I lost weight. It's so freeing. It's so liberating to be able to eat that way. I almost always felt like I was going to be sick. I could never leave the house without emergency food. You don't have to be spending $26 a pound on beef to have the benefits of the carnivore diet.
Hey folks, it's Dr. Shawn Baker here. Hey, if you or someone you love is suffering from chronic disease and you're tired of just managing symptoms with potions, pills, and procedures, I want you to check out Revero.com. Our team of dedicated professionals is committed to tackling the root cause of your issue and finally getting you healthy. Hurry up, though. Our spaces are filling up very quickly. Well, welcome. Today we have with us Mary Grace. She is someone who I met personally way back in I think last year in Oklahoma at one of the Clay Clark's event, and I've actually been on her program, I think twice now, if I'm not mistaken. I think so. And you are, I guess, someone who has personal experience with carnivore diet. And I guess maybe just for those that don't know you, Mary, just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I actually also have a podcast, and I do the Mary Grace Show, and I focus on a variety of topics, one of which is wellness and the health sector, especially things that are outside of what I would call legacy healthcare, if you want to call it healthcare, the business of medicine. And so that's how I contacted you to ask you if you would come on my show. And, one of the reasons that I got into the idea of carnivore was that I have been pursuing some health goals for quite a long time, and I was struggling to get to where I wanted to go. But that's basically it. I'm very active. I live in Virginia, and I'm also a caregiver for my 87-year-old dad who recently went through a stroke. And so I have a high level of motivation to be healthy mentally, physically, spiritually, all around, so that I can do my professional and personal life to the best of my ability. Yeah.
Was there a time in your life where you weren't particularly healthy?
Yes, there was. I grew up actually with pretty severe asthma, bronchial asthma. I'm old enough to have grown up in a house with smokers, which didn't help. But I also know now that my diet most likely contributed to it. I've always had a sweet tooth. And so I think the tendency to eat sugar has never really helped me. And so I think from college on, I was always pursuing different ways to get healthier. I also struggled with deep, sometimes debilitating depression throughout different phases of my life, even to the point of considering the extremes and like a low level anxiety. And then I found out around 2011 that I had an autoimmune condition known as Hashimoto's. And that was kind of a kick in the gut when I found that out, because I was going through a lot of emotional turmoil and very, very high stress at the time. I was in a very high stress life situation. And I don't know what was the chicken or the egg, but it certainly made sense when I started to find out what was going on. I was put on Synthroid. I was given some nutraceuticals by my doctor who figured out what was going wrong. And initially it helped, but I don't know if other people on Synthroid have found this out, or levothyroxine, but there seems to be a honeymoon phase, and then it doesn't work anymore. And that certainly was the case with me. I actually started losing my hair when I was taking that medication. And so I would say that my life has been a yo-yo process of feeling great, pursuing dietary and lifestyle changes, but never really feeling like I had that edge. And I did plant-based for a while. I mean, I've done a whole bunch of different things. And then I had a bad case of COVID in 2021. And after that, I was what I would consider like a raging carboholic. It triggered something in me that made it very difficult. I lost my smell for almost a year. And maybe that's why. Maybe that's why I just wanted, super palatable foods. I don't know what it was, but I ended up gaining weight and I just wasn't myself. So that's a long answer to have I been healthy? I've wanted to be healthy. I just haven't quite, I hadn't quite gotten there with all the things I had pursued.
Okay. And so now you're currently pursuing a carnivore diet.
Yes.
I believe.
Yes.
Has that made any impactful difference in overall health?
It has. I was at the time after the COVID bout, I had gained the weight. I was really frustrated. I was definitely struggling with the sugar and carb cravings constant. And that was in 2022, I ran into a friend I hadn't seen in a while, and she had lost a lot of weight. And she told me that she had been using something called semaglutide, which we now know is Ozempic. And I was at that point kind of desperate to change, to make a change, like just to get something that would flip the switch of what I was struggling with. And so I started on that in October of 2022. And I was on it through the winter into the spring. And I lost weight, but I also lost all of my energy. I could barely eat. That's why I lost weight. And I didn't have nutritional support in the process. I really didn't have counseling with it to understand what was happening with my body. And I think that had I had that, I probably would have made a more concerted effort to actually eat and to incorporate a low carb lifestyle in that. I think it may have been a better outcome. But what happened is that I took it. I was happy with the weight loss, but 100% not happy with the lack of energy and the loss of muscle, things like that. So there's definitely a trade-off. And then of course, when I stopped taking it, it was a very quick turnaround to where the cravings started to come back, the weight started to creep back up. So it definitely was not a fix. It wasn't a long-term fix. And so through the winter of 2023, I was still trying to figure out like, okay, what am I going to do? Am I going to go back on the semaglutide? What's going to happen? A friend told me about Carnivore. She had been doing it with real success. And she had had an eating disorder for many, many years and struggled with cravings and addictions and things like that. And she said it completely turned her around, that she would never go back. And I was skeptical because I was afraid of the additives and antibiotics and all of the things that you think about when you consider eating factory farmed meats. March of 2024, I heard an interview with a lady called Maggie. She's pretty well known, I think, in the carnivore community. She's, I think, in her 80s, and she's been carnivore for a very long time. And she was explaining the process of what happens in the stomachs of the ruminant animals and how they essentially eradicate a lot of the toxins that you might otherwise get even from, factory farmed meats. And it just, for me, that's what I needed to get the permission to go carnivore, to realize that I didn't have to be in this ultra strict, grass-fed, grass-finished, super expensive pursuit of the perfect meat. And so I went pretty much full full on carnivore after that. The light bulb went off. I thought, what have I got to lose? And so I started, beef, butter, bacon, eggs. And then I gained weight. So that was a little jarring. And I think I understand why, but I was definitely not one of those people that had that miraculous sort of instant weight loss story. Now, mind you, I wasn't obese and I didn't have a lot of the metabolic issues that people who had tons of water weight to lose, for example. I wasn't in that category, but at the time, you can imagine the stress, the added stress of going, boom, 20 pounds, within 6 weeks. It was a little crazy.
Yeah, for sure. Sure. That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, since you had that experience with the semaglutide, because, I think a lot of people are jumping on that wagon. And I
Yes,
think a lot of
yes.
them are going to be disappointed,
Yeah.
sadly. And, I mean, we'll probably get a lot, like right now, I have a lot of ex-plant-based people within the carnivore space. I mean, there's other types, there's a lot of them, it seems like, because they tried it, it failed. I think we're going to get a lot of Ozempic users and whatnot, because,
Yeah.
it's something that, side effects, expense, obviously as soon as you stop it, comes right back. So let me ask you about, you said you had these hesitations because, the factory farm meat is all full of hormones and
Yeah.
antibiotics and all this stuff. And I've tried to fight against that, over the years. And in fact, somebody said, how would you ever eat that trash grocery store meat? And I'm like, that's 50% what I eat. It's just
Yeah.
like, and I'm
Yeah.
fine. I mean,
Yeah.
I've had the privilege of meeting thousands upon thousands of people do that exact same thing. They go to Walmart, Costco, Safeway, whatever, eat meat, and they put their diabetes in remission. They lose 50 pounds.
Right.
Their autoimmune disease goes away. Their diabetes goes away, on and on and on. So I'm like, this is just silly to make these, call that some garbage or trash or something like that. It just doesn't make sense to me. Have you, so again, your improvement in your health came from just eating kind of regular beef that you get maybe at the grocery store, or how does it
Yes,
go?
I started out, I think like a lot of people do when they go to carnivore, is I ate a ton of bacon. And I was getting like the Costco bacon. And I think for some people, especially people who are used to eating sweets, bacon is a good bridge food. I hardly eat it now. I switched in the process, once I got my fill of bacon, I switched over to beef, mostly beef and eggs. I experimented with a couple other things. I've never been a big chicken or turkey lover, so that was just not even a consideration. But ground beef, I was doing ribeyes a lot in the beginning, and it can be a pretty high commitment and high cost level. And as I started to get more into the carnivore community, I started to get more ideas about things that I could do on a lower budget and also just easier time wise. Because I'm a caregiver, it's not always practical for me even to just cook a steak at any given time. So what I started doing was getting short ribs, chuck roast, things that I could cook a few pounds at a time in the slow cooker, and then I could have food accessible throughout the week. That works for me. And I can, make a couple scrambled eggs, have some beef, some short ribs, like the boneless short ribs from Costco, things like that. It's so easy to take it out of the fridge and heat it up or eat it cold. It tastes great cold. And for me and the lifestyle that I have, it's so much easier. Like, for example, my dad was in the hospital with a stroke and then he was in rehab, and that was a 5-week process. And if there's ever a time you're going to go off the wagon, that's when it is. And I was really thankful that even the day that he went in the hospital, I had short ribs in the crock pot. And so I came home that night, and I mean, it was just the most wonderful thing to open that crock pot and have a dish of hot beef that I could eat after a day of stress. There was no munching on carbs or chips or mindless eating or anything like that, which I would have done in the past. And I thought that I was doing healthy because it was organic and, organic canola oil and things like that. And that wasn't actually helping me. So I've definitely been on a journey of figuring out the best foods for my lifestyle. And also my dad he's type 2 diabetes. And so around the time that I started carnivore, his weight had crept up. He's only 5'4", and he was almost 200 pounds. So I recruited him to what I would call ketovore lifestyle. It would have been a little extreme for an 87-year-old man to go only meat. And so I put him on, super low carb, like keto, but he still had some vegetables and, low oxalate vegetables and things like that, which really helped him when he was in the hospital because he had lost 20 pounds. But that's another story. But I guess it's combined because it was easy for me to cook for both of us and to do that in bulk, kind of. So now I think that I spend way less on groceries than I would have spent had I stayed with plant-based, anything close to standard American diet. And the other thing is I spend way less time. I mean, I can't imagine in the time, for example, when my dad was sick, having the food prep that's required for being in a plant-based diet, all the chopping and preparation, and then like all the food guilt of things going bad because you don't get to what's in the crisper drawer, and then you open it up and there's some dead broccoli or spinach in there. Everybody knows what I'm talking about. And you don't get that with carnivore. You cook the meat and you either freeze a portion or you eat it all and then you start over. It's like just rinse and repeat. At least for me. Now you're a little different because you can eat like a giant steak in one sitting, but I've never been a big volume eater. So this is actually perfect for me to have everything prepared and then just take out what I want and eat it when I'm hungry and eat it till I'm full. It's so freeing. It's so liberating to be able to eat that way.
Yeah, I mean, so and that's because it's almost ironic because a lot of people say, "Oh, it's such a restrictive diet. You don't get to eat pasta and bread and fruits and vegetables and things like that." But at the same time, a lot of people will say it's actually very freeing to me because I don't feel compelled to eat those things. I don't feel I'm not addicted to some of this stuff anymore.
Right.
So just for sake of comparison, because you did do a plant-based diet,
yes,
and there's people that would argue that a plant-based diet is far superior to any stupid old saturated fat carnivore diet. What was your experience? How would you compare and contrast the two of those?
Wow. I was thinking about that before this interview. What was my experience? When I first started plant-based, I was using a really high quality, organic, green shake kind of thing. And I was following the plan, which included salads and raw vegetables and limited lean protein and things like that. And I did lose weight, but I think it was because of calorie restriction. Because when you first start the plan, there's what's called like a cleansing phase, where it's mainly a liquid diet when you get down to it. The experience that I had physically was that I almost always felt like I was going to be sick. and I think one of the things that they would always say is, well, that's your body detoxing, right? You have parasites, you have all these things that are built up in your colon. And when you start to eat this really high nutrient food, your body is going to detox. But the problem that I had is that I never got through that phase. So, I would feel pretty intense gastric discomfort and nausea pretty much every time I had one of the green shakes. And then the other thing that would happen was that I would get super hangry almost immediately after eating it. And now I realize that it was basically a full carb diet, for lack of a better word, especially when you have something in shake form where you're not even getting the fiber that would give you the satiety that might keep you from getting hangry immediately. Like you might get hangry an hour later. But I was constantly in a little bit of what I would call food anxiety because I could never leave the house without emergency food. And that I'm serious. So I always had like nut butters, things that I thought were healthy, right? But and on the scale of plant-based diet, I thought I was being super healthy. In other words, like I ate organic, I ate, shakes that were tested for heavy metals. I had a pure approach to the plant-based lifestyle as opposed to a commercialized, packaged, what I would call frankenfoods, right? I wasn't eating things like tofurkey and things like that. I was eating real food, but it wasn't sustaining me. The other thing that I had was I still had a lot of joint pain. I had a lot of anxiety, and here's the crazy thing about the anxiety. I never knew that I was living in a constant state of underlying anxiety until I went carnivore. And I was a couple of weeks into carnivore and I was driving in traffic up near DC. Anybody that's ever driven into DC or any city knows that if you have anxiety, that's when it's going to be tested the most. And I was in traffic, and that's not my norm. Like I'm not normally driving in urban traffic. And so, your anxiety is heightened. And so I was driving in traffic and people did what they're doing, just normal driving, cutting off, changing lanes. You're trying to make sure you don't miss your exit, all of that. And this guy cut me off. And I remember thinking, I was like, oh, you know what? You just do what you need to do. It's okay. You go ahead of me. And I thought, who was that? Was that me not even caring if somebody cut me off in traffic? And I all of a sudden I realized I don't have any anxiety right now. I have no anxiety. And that was when it hit me that I had always operated at a level of anxiety that I had just become used to. And I didn't know until I went carnivore that that's not normal. It may be common, but it's not normal. It was very eye-opening.
Hey folks, it's Dr. Shawn Baker here. Hey, if you or someone you love is suffering from chronic disease and you're tired of just managing symptoms with potions, pills, and procedures, I want you to check out Revero.com. Our team of dedicated professionals is committed to tackling the root cause of your issue and finally getting you healthy. Hurry up, though. Our spaces are filling up very quickly. Yeah, a lot of people notice that. Very similar thing. In fact, there was a paper that was done recently on anxiety, depression, and essentially a carnivore diet. They call it an animal-based ketogenic diet, which is effectively a carnivore diet. And they saw that anxiety within about 7 weeks for the patients enrolled in the study improves to the point where it was gone, which is interesting. And you think about, and I know your show has a lot more broader topics, but I do think that when we look at how society functions and some of the problems we have, when you got so many people that are anxious and annoyed and pissed off,
Yeah.
Because they're eating a crappy diet, probably
Yeah.
it doesn't make society work any better. It probably makes it a lot worse. And so if we had a bunch of kind of chilled out and happy people, I just think the world would be a better place. Maybe. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree. And I've given this a lot of thought because I came of age in the late 70s, early 80s. And that was when fat-free, low-fat snack wells came into being. Anybody that is from that time knows what I'm talking about. Take all the fat out and increase the sugar and the artificial flavorings to make up for the lack of satiety and flavor that the fat lacks. You were cooking everything with applesauce, canola oil, all these things. And so, that was when the anxiety and depression that I had I'd been on the edge of that in high school. and in early college. It hit me full force as I was getting to the end of my college years and beyond. And looking back now, I I want to reclaim my time because I was doing what I really truly thought was right. And I had actually talked to a dietitian who was telling me these things, and I believed and trusted her that fat-free was the way to go. And now I'm convinced that, the deep depression that I experienced, the lack of motivation, the confusion, the anxiety, even the suicidal tendencies were directly related to that diet because I was malnourished. I had almost no fat in my system. And that went on for years and years. I don't even know what kind of damage was done. And the other piece of that, which I think a lot of people experience, is that I'm a Christian. And as a Christian, you know in your heart, if you study scripture, there's 365 verses that say do not be afraid. There's a lot of verses that talk about not being anxious, casting your cares on God. And so there's this cognitive dissonance that you have as a Christian, understanding and knowing scripture and what the Bible tells you, but at the same time having this underlying intense anxiety and rage almost, and not being able to reconcile those two, because then you add layers of guilt of thinking I'm doing something wrong. And as a Christian, when you're being put on antidepressants and you're under suicide watch, there's a lot of confusion and guilt that piles on in that process. And and so I don't know if I'm explaining that very well, but it adds to the anxiety. It adds to the intense emotion that you have because you know on a deep level that Christians are supposed to have peace, that we're supposed to be moving in peace and operating without anxiety. And yet there's this uncontrollable monster that's hitting you at every turn. And come to find out now, it was the diet. And so I think that you are very, very much over the target here, which is that if we had an overhaul in our diet and people were not eating addictive foods, which we know now are laden with addictive chemicals, we would have a completely different scenario. And I'll say one more thing about the Christian community is a lot of Christians who've come out of, addictive behaviors like drinking, smoking, that lifestyle, unfortunately, the food element has not been dealt with. And so there's a lot of obesity, there's a lot of food culture in the church that has people trapped because, any social gathering is focused on food. Unfortunately, it's a lot of carbs and packaged foods and ultra processed foods. And so, that causes damage, and that's a topic we could go down for days. But you look at you look at that subset of society, and there's a lot of metabolic disease there. So it's troubling. It's very troubling.
Yeah, I mean, you reference the references in the Bible about not being anxious.
Yeah.
There's a lot of references to eating meat in the Bible too. I
Yes.
mean, it's definitely not shy about slaughtering animals, sacrificing animals, feasting on animals.
Yeah.
That's featured heavily in the Bible. And I think you're absolutely, a lot of the church gatherings often, lots of pies, and the canned cake breakfast and all this stuff. And so, I mean, I think you're absolutely right with that stuff.
And that's something I would like to see changed. Hopefully, as people start to embrace this lifestyle, it will become more mainstream within the church. And I think that a lot of the emotional and the physical, metabolic, and emotional problems that are being dealt with in the church are going to ease. And that's not to say that, people don't have things they have to deal with, relationally. emotionally, things like that. It's not going to solve all of your problems. I mean, if you haven't dealt with your baggage, you have to do that. But I'm talking about like at least get people on a level playing field so that you can just separate what's metabolic and what is relational or spiritual, because there's a gray line there right now. You know, when somebody who's a Christian is crippled by anxiety, that just adds to the anxiety because you know you're not supposed to have that.
Yeah, fair enough. So you, like I said, you've got you obviously got a large podcast, a fairly large audience.
Yeah,
I expect you talk about some of this nutritional stuff from time to time.
we do.
How is that received within your community? Because my community is largely low carb people that already get
Hmm.
it, and so I don't get
Hmm.
as much. I mean, what every once in a while I go on to a show and it's kind of mixed. Some people think I'm an idiot. Some people think,
Yeah.
I've helped them tremendously. How is that being approached how is that being received within your audience if and when you talk about it?
I think my audience is very receptive. I've been working with a couple of, I have a functional medicine doctor who comes on my show. We've been working with him for over a year now. And I also have a naturopath. And so, you know, the emphasis is on taking personal responsibility and educating yourself. And for the most part, I find that my audience is receptive. Every now and then you get people who have kind of bought into that more traditional system where they're trusting the people in the white coats with the stethoscope to tell them what to do. But for the most part, because I'm in what people would consider kind of the truther movement, my audience already has a proclivity not to trust established thought and ideas. And so they're more open when something like this comes along. You know, I mean, I have people who are preppers, right? They've already bought a half a cow and things like that. And so this is not too far off the reservation. Now, the idea of eating only meat is certainly stretching some people's idea of what's appropriate and good. But I would say that my audience is definitely leaning more toward accepting this. You know, I for the most part, I mean, I don't have a bunch of people that are addicted to the standard American diet and ultra processed foods. And for example, the functional medicine team that I work with, they tell me that anytime they get patients referred by me, the patients that they get from my audience are very well educated, very dialed in, very aware, and motivated. And so that makes me feel good because I feel like we've done something right to help move the needle in this area. And I'll continue to do that. I mean, I'll continue to have you back on the show, other influencers in this space for sure, because I want people to be able to walk into their God-given destiny. And part of my role is to give them the tools to do that and then to make their own decisions about what it is that they're going to use and incorporate.
Now, I mean, obviously, we're all aware. We just had a recent, election. Trump is now getting the president sworn in, and I guess 2 days, 3 days now. I guess on Monday. I guess it's Monday.
Yeah.
And so, whether RFK gets confirmed or not, that's still very much a question mark. I think. I mean, and this "Make America Healthy Again" movement has gotten some teeth behind it. I mean, I saw they're just going to ban red dye. Red dye number 3, but I mean that's kind of symbolic. I don't think that's the main problem with the food, but I mean it's at least symbolic in that it shows that changes could potentially happen.
Mm-hmm.
Are you, the people you talk to, are anybody involved in that circle? I know they had asked me to go down to Mar-a-Lago and speak to Trump and RFK, but the hurricane came in and I didn't get to go because the hurricane canceled the event. But what are your thoughts around can the government do it? Is the government going to fix us, do you think, or do you think that's just going to be a kind of a more of a, I don't know, a compromise thing?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'll tell you my sort of thought is I think we can do a little bit. I think it's going to depend on all of us at the end of the day. But what are you seeing? Are you talking to people that are involved in this stuff?
I think it's a combination. One of the most powerful things the government has at their disposal is access to the information space. And so I think that if the government is smart, and when I say the government, I guess I mean RFK Jr., if he gets elected, and he has people like Nicole Shanahan in his space, he does have some people that I know and I'm working with, people like you. I think if they're smart, they're going to leverage the influencers in the information space to help get the word out, similar to what they did 4 years ago when the country was under a medical alert, that they used a lot of what I would call propaganda to influence society. I believe that can be turned around for good, that they can start to change the messaging. And a big part of that, I believe, has to do, it depends on, is predicated on getting into the systems that have the budgets to put out communication. For example, HHS. If you're going into a doctor's office and they're handing you the government issued USDA My Plate chart or the CDC's diabetes management paperwork, that has to be changed. And I think that if they can get into the communication space, if they can dial into that and hone in on changing the communication around food and nutrition, that will go a long way. But I believe that we are in a unique position of having access to censorship-free platforms now, and we can get this information out. And I think that Trump is committed to doing that. I mean, he's known now as the podcast president because he was going on these podcasts like Rogan and some of the Gen Z podcasts. I think that's really going to be the key. So I don't think it's going to be a one-pronged approach. I think it's going to be a multi-pronged approach. But one of those things really is going to be leveraging the government's ability to influence the information space in the legacy medical arena, especially with the public education of the masses. They've done it already. They've already done it with the disinformation, the malinformation of telling people that they should live on carbohydrates and ultra processed foods. They just need to turn that messaging around and get the buy-in. I mean, there was a time when the government was telling people that smoking was good for pregnant women. And so, if they're determined to get a message out, they'll get it out.
Yeah, I mean, and you mentioned, the sort of the COVID pandemic. How many people on the planet don't know about you're supposed to stand 6 feet away? I think every human was exposed to that ad nauseum. I mean, you couldn't go anywhere. And to think, and the resources they stuck into that, maybe $1 trillion worth of resources in messaging, they could easily do that around things like ultra processed foods. I mean, if the will was there, it could certainly be done, and I think that's the shame and that was a frustration I had during COVID. I was like, look, you're spending all this time telling people this. Why don't you tell them to not eat junk food for a little while?
It's not profitable.
I mean, it was kind of it was insane.
And the other thing too is I think you do have to make it profitable, and you can't hamstring these corporations that have made a profit off of sickness. I mean, you can't cripple the entire economy. And so if you can shift the focus and not cripple the economy, that's better. So for example, if you are making it easier for restaurants to source high quality beef tallow, and that, the suppliers of these products can shift their focus, you're going to have a much better buy-in. But if you tell a seed oil supplier, we're putting you out of business in favor of meat-based products, they're going to fight back. I mean, they have an industry to protect. They have jobs to protect. And so I think if anybody can do that, it's somebody like Donald Trump, because he understands negotiation at the business level. So I'm interested to see how he handles that. I mean, we've already seen is it In-N-Out Burger that, no, not In-N-Out, Steak and Shake.
Steak and
Yeah,
Shake just announced they're going 100% tallow
yeah.
meat.
And
Yeah.
so I think that if you have a combination of influence, public pressure, public demand, I think that it has to be sort of a cyclical relationship, because the more the public becomes aware, the more they're going to demand these things. And then the more the corporations are going to adjust to supply. It's a supply and demand question, but it's also a government and regulatory equation that allows these companies to make these shifts and still remain profitable. Now, do we want these companies to continue to remain profitable at the expense of people's health? Absolutely not. And so there's going to have to be some give and take. That's my take on it. But the other thing I noticed too is that we have a couple of generations coming up, the younger Gen Z and the generation after them. They're looking and they're seeing a lot of the mistakes that were made. And like, for example, my niece is 24, sorry. And she has so much more awareness at her age than a lot of people in their 60s and 70s. And she's thinking about these things. A lot of people her age are thinking about these things in a way that perhaps we weren't, and they have access to so much more information. And a lot of them are influencers. And so, are we going to turn around the ocean liner of the boomer generation to reverse their health, their metabolic health completely? I don't know. But we can at least influence the food supply so that if they're grabbing a bag of chips, they're not saturating their body with seed oils. Maybe they're just getting tallow instead. But I think if the focus is on the younger generations, you definitely have a chance to bring a lasting generational change, because that's what was done in the 80s, right? The generational changes, I think it started back in the 50s, right? But we're seeing the repercussions of those efforts to introduce ultra processed foods into the food supply. But I think we can turn it around a little bit faster now. I think because of the speed of information, we can have a faster turnaround. I don't think it's going to take 2 or 3 generations or 3 decades like it did the last time. I hope not.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about the younger generation being educated, they just have more access to information.
Yeah.
I mean, and quite honestly, the only reason the message that I've been putting out, and I'm certainly not the first guy to talk. I mean, you can go back to the 1700s and see physicians talking about it, but in the 1700s, you're not going to talk to not 100,000 people,
right?
Maybe 50 people if you're lucky. And so now, light, information travels at the speed of light, basically. And so, I mean, it's a fun time to be in some ways. And in other ways, it's a little bit of a scary time. We see all the things that are being talked about, how we're going to, how they're going to implement the future, depending on who's in charge, I suppose, or what we accept.
Yeah. The other, can I add one thing too? I think there's going to be a more equitable distribution of health outcomes. And what I mean by that is that typically now you see more affluent people who tend to be healthier, right? They tend to have access to more organic foods, things like that. And I think because of the nature of information now, it's much more likely that somebody at a lower socioeconomic bracket is going to be able to have access to the information and to what's needed to get healthy. Because as we talked about earlier, you can get hamburger. You can reverse your metabolic issues on, 80-20 hamburger that's $3-4 a pound. You don't have to be spending $26 a pound on beef to have the benefits of the carnivore diet. And I think that's the key, because you have a level playing field across socioeconomic realms that really is not that present in sort of the organic plant-based world. The food deserts are real. especially when it comes to fresh produce that people emphasize in that plant-based world. What do you think about that?
Well, in my book, I literally said, kind of not totally kidding, but I said, every quote unquote food desert has like a McDonald's. I mean, they're
Yeah,
everywhere, right?
yeah, yeah.
And and if you don't eat the bun and you don't eat the French fries, you
Yep,
don't eat the Coke,
yep.
and you just eat the burger patties, relatively cheap.
Mhm.
And it's cooked. It's cooked. You don't have to cook it. It's already cooked for you.
Yeah,
You're getting a
yeah,
burger patty for a. I go in there. I go in places like that, and it's a little more now, but it was $1.29 a burger patty or whatever, and you can eat 4 of those, and for $5 you've got a pound of cooked ground beef, that's
yeah,
cooked for you even.
yeah,
So I mean, the solution to that, if you go to like some of these poor rural areas or inner city areas where definitely people are they're eating what they can afford, and it's ultra processed
yeah.
garbage, because you can go to the store and get 3 boxes of cereal for $5 or something like that, or
Hmm.
it depends on where you're at now, but
Little Debbie.
so I mean it the I don't know, if all of a sudden everybody in America said, oh, I go to McDonald's and get burger patties and not get anything else, that wouldn't be sustainable for them. They don't quickly say, wait a minute, we can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
But I do think that absolutely. I mean, and most people that I talk to, if they're willing to eat things like ground beef, and I eat ground beef all the time. There's nothing wrong with it. It's great. I think it tastes delicious. If they do that, they find that their grocery budget goes down significantly for most of them. It's not prohibitively cost prohibitive. It's very accessible. And I think that's an important part of the messaging. When I see people saying, oh, don't eat that trash grocery store meat, only eat grass finished stuff that's been blessed by Himalayan monks, and I'm like, come on, man, that's total nonsense. It's not the real world. Yeah. So that's an interesting thing. Now, of course, we've got this sort of climate change narrative that's also being been pushed quite heavily, and of course, people are like, well, it may be a little bit healthier, but it's no healthier than a plant-based diet. And cow farts are boiling the oceans, as my friend Saifuddin Amos just likes to say. Yeah, so you've got to sort of unbrainwash people from that narrative as well, because I think that's been sort of, most people have been trained to believe that eating meat is bad for the environment, which I think is not necessarily true. And in many cases, it's the complete opposite.
And that message has been pushed since at least the 70s. There was a book that came out called Diet for a Small Planet at that time. And thankfully we have people like Joel Salatin, really good authors, who are refuting those concepts. But I think one of the most telling things that you can do to refute that argument is to follow the life cycle of an almond. The almond production or pistachio production in this country alone, the amount of water and resources required to do any kind of what's called monocrops, but particularly growing the almonds. I mean, it's a staggering amount of water that's required to produce a pound of almonds, and people forget that, and they also don't understand, people who are approaching this from a standpoint of maybe protecting the animals, right? They have an ethical feeling. They feel some kind of way about what's being done to the cow or the chicken or whatever. I don't think they understand what's being done to all of the little animals that live in the earth when you are doing large scale industrial farming and turning over the earth and displacing entire populations of one or two species of animals to get everybody their avocados or their almonds or the things that are the backbone of a plant-based diet. That's something that I think requires a little more education. And if people understood that, they would realize that their concerns are really misguided when it comes to the ideas that they have about what are the dangers or damages caused to the animals and by the animals in an animal-based diet. I mean, you go back to, again, the Bible. It was, and before that, even like the mid-19th century, I read a lot of historic fiction. And when people were traveling the country to settle the West, the Midwest, the West, the scene is always something like this. They're traveling by wagon. Many times they're walking on foot. They're probably eating one meal a day. No, they're not stopping 3 times a day to cook, especially not in, more dangerous territory. And the very first thing they do when they stop is there's two things. They set up shelter, and then somebody goes out to shoot meat. Like, nobody's going out to forage for wild lettuce. That's a backup food. The very first thing they're doing, and even along the way, there's always somebody that's riding out to look for meat. Why is that? Because they knew that if they shot a buffalo or they got a bear or a deer or an elk, that it would sustain the family and the group for days and days and days. That the first priority wasn't that they would be going out looking for greens and berries. That was just the backup food. That they only did that if they couldn't get meat. So they
Yeah.
knew.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's like I said, there's a lot of, but I mean, I guess the problem is, like you said, you grew up, I was born in 67, so I grew up, kind of 70s,
Yeah.
early 80s. And I mean, from that time on, and probably before that, you go to the grocery store and there's just, there's everything you need. I mean, there's more than what you need. And
Yeah.
that, I guess people who grew up today have no concept of what it was like. And I don't really, but 100 years ago, 150 years ago,
Mhm.
there ain't that much stuff in a grocery store. I mean, it's like
No.
you might have a sack of flour, some sugar, some eggs, some milk, maybe some meat, maybe if you're lucky, some fruit, a couple of vegetables. And that's about it. I mean, you didn't have all these thousands of products, which are, 17 different colors and brightly labeled boxes and all the, like all the shelf stable stuff, the preservatives, the emulsifiers,
Mhm.
the thickening agents, on and on, stabilizers. So we've
Yeah.
got a very different
Yeah.
concept of food than what it's been for most of humanity.
Even when I was little, my family, my extended family had a farm. And we didn't eat a lot of packaged foods because the food came from the farm. There was pork, there was beef, there was milk. I mean, the taste of raw milk, I can still remember that. It was amazing. All of the vegetables were canned at home, and there we rarely went to the grocery store, which is, thinking about that now, it's like you said, you just open an app, you order the food, it comes to your door. And even when I was younger, that's not how my family did things. And everything that we ate, almost everything was made from scratch. And thankfully, we had really good cooks in my family. And then if we did eat out, I was just talking about this with a friend the other day, the only time you ate out was on a special occasion, a birthday. Every now and then, like, grandpa would take all the kids for ice cream, but it was like one time in the summer, and that was it. So the culture, it's a combination. It's a culture of eating out and having the convenience foods, but also the foods themselves have become so toxic that it's a deadly combination. And plus the sedentary lifestyles. That's the other trifecta in that combination that is deadly.
Yeah, for sure. Mary, unfortunately, we run out of time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for doing this. It's been fun. I'm sure we'll talk again quite a bit.
Thank you.
People that want to find out more about you in particular, do you have what's the website? Where do they go?
They can go to marygracemedia.com, and all of my social networks are linked there on the website. And anybody that wants to get in touch with me can go to my email, info@marygracemedia.com, and you can watch the Mary Grace Show directly from my website there. Thank you so much, Shawn, for having me.
Yeah, you guys check it out. I've been on the show a couple of times, so thanks a bunch, guys.
Awesome.
Y'all take care.